All right, guys, I'm especially excited about this. My guest this week is James Miller. Now, James is the creator of Adamantine Yoga. He's also one of the most innovative thinkers I think I've ever met. And that's not a phrase I throw around lightly. Now, James has been bringing his unique thinking and approach to life, his approach to life to the world of yoga. And I believe he's on the verge of a huge breakthrough, which we will talk more about later in the episode. But I can tell you, he's already pulled off at least one major miracle, and that's getting me, yes, me, to practice yoga. And I'll be totally honest, I have been loving it. Now, James comes to yoga after being a Marine. And when he started, he'd be the first to tell you can do things like 1 billion push-ups or 30 pull-ups, but he couldn't touch his toes, and his body had taken a beating. And he introduced himself to yoga, and it really changed things. Now, it's been a number of years ago that happened, and he is now one of the most flexible people I have ever met. And at 48 years old, he's also in the best shape of his life. And since I turned 50, that's right, 50, next year, I've said that that's one of my goals, is to be in the best shape of my life in my 50th year and beyond. So James and his approach really caught my attention. Now, apparently, I'm a little late to the game when it comes to yoga, and a recent study found that over 20 million Americans or more practice yoga on a regular basis, and that continues to grow every year. And I hear a number of you, I hear from a bunch of you that you practice it and you love it. So we'll be talking about some of the strengths of yoga and some of the misperceptions and big questions around it too. But here's the thing, whether you've ever practiced yoga or not, whether you think you'll ever try it or not, I think hearing from James on his outlook on life and business and the 4 tenets his school are based upon are going to benefit you greatly. So stay tuned for that. Most importantly, James lives here in Des Moines with his wonderful wife, Ann. And as you can tell, I'm super stoked about this conversation. So let's get to it. James, welcome to Dream, Think, Do, buddy.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's such an honor to be on your podcast, Mitch.
This is fun. This is fun. So, okay, let's time jump here a little bit. Let's go back to Marine Corps days. You're coming out of the Marines. You're in great shape, but your body's taking a beating. So, like, what made you think as a Marine, I should try yoga? I can't imagine that was a real common thing.
Well, I can give you a specific experience I had in the Marine Corps that made me realize something I was doing was wrong.
Yeah.
I distinctly remember we never stretched in the Marine Corps.
Really?
And yeah, never stretched. We always did pull-ups and push-ups and sit-ups and ran all the time.
Yeah.
But there was this one morning, I was in Okinawa, Japan, and I remember distinctly sitting down on this cool, wet grass. And for some reason, the person that was leading PT that day encouraged us to reach forward and touch our toes. And at that time, I was spending 1 or 2 hours a day training, more than anybody I knew. And by far, I was the tightest person there. Like, I couldn't even get within 2 feet of touching my toes. There was nowhere near. And for some reason that day, it kind of registered with me, something I was doing was wrong.
Yeah, something's broken.
You know? Yeah. So when I left the Marine Corps, I opened up a personal training studio.
Yeah.
I was teaching people, your typical lifting weights and cardiovascular exercise, mostly focusing on weight loss. And somebody brought in a yoga DVD. And it was a videotape. This was back in the 90s, right? So,
let's be honest, VHS all the way, baby. Yeah.
And I popped it in, and I remember trying it for the first time. And once again, I had this moment, this epiphany. I'm terrible at this, right?
Yeah.
If any of you know downward facing dog, trying to grab my foot and pull it forward to step between my hands was a chore back then.
Yeah.
And I realized this was something I needed to do. So from that day forward, I started practicing, and it has radically changed my life.
That's incredible. And you really have dug in. I mean, how long ago was that? How many years ago was that this journey started for you?
Well, I am 48. I consider that I started practicing around the age of 25. I can't say for sure. I left the Marine Corps at 24, and I opened that studio right away. So it was about 25. But, it becomes hard to track back when you actually started, because it's when did you start seriously?
Right.
So I started practicing yoga, but it wasn't serious until I was probably 30.
When did it start to click for you that maybe this was something more than just a hobby?
I think fitness was always a passion for me.
Yeah.
I think yoga kind of eclipsed fitness when I started to recognize that there was more happening than physical change. when I
Mm,
started to notice that I was changing as a person.
yeah.
That's when it became like a lifestyle.
Well, it's funny because like I joked in your intro, but seriously, I don't know that I've mocked yoga, but I have definitely never thought that it would be something I would do, right? Like I know I did martial arts. You know this part of my story. I did
Hmm.
martial arts in college, early on in my like professional career, and then got away from it and my body just stiffened up. Plus last 15, 20 years of speaking and traveling and all that stuff just beat the snots out of my body. So I have far, as you well know, far from limber. So I'm like, I don't want to get in a room of people that are all stretchy and all that that
Hmm.
stuff, right?
Absolutely.
And so it's an interesting thing where it's like, okay, don't I don't think that's for me. But as you and I have continued to talk, as I've gotten more familiar with your story, more familiar with your approach, it's like, wait a second, one, former Marine, I think I can learn from this guy. To hear
Hmm.
that you could basically touch your kneecaps and that was it, like, okay, I can get on board with that, and then now see where you're at is incredible. And I know, for you, it really has been a journey of studying a number of different approaches, because what we have in the United States is obviously, it's gone through a number of different iterations, that kind of thing. Tell us a little bit about your journey of kind of understanding yoga and arriving at Adamantine Yoga. I mean, this approach that you really have created.
Well, it's quite a story in some ways.
Yeah.
I mean, I've kind of passed through all the phases of American yoga myself. When I started, I was a personal trainer. I had a personal training studio.
Yeah.
So I learned basically by myself, from a book. This
Huh.
was in DeKalb, Illinois, back in, the mid 90s.
The
Nobody was,
mecca of
yeah,
yoga.
I mean, nobody was teaching yoga. I was like, getting it straight out of a book, right?
Yeah.
And doing very rudimentary things, sun salutation style yoga, which to this day is the basis of most vinyasa flow classes you'll experience at your average studio.
Hmm.
So just this kind of transition based yoga where you flow from pose to pose.
Mm-hmm.
Well, eventually I came across a style known as Ashtanga Vinyasa Yoga. And that is, it happens to be one of the most traditional forms of yoga there is. And it's based upon a set sequence of movements.
Hmm.
But what I didn't know at the time, and most people to this day don't realize, is it was a perfect series of movements for a body about 100 years ago of
Hmm.
like a 12-year-old Indian boy. Okay. So
Interesting.
like it didn't fit
Totally
my
describe me in every way,
yeah,
right?
me too. So like, here I was hitting my head against the wall for years, trying the sequence that wasn't designed for my body.
And
And
how do you mean, like, as far as 100 years ago, how would that have been different?
well, it's very easy to explain. 100 years ago, the average person in India didn't sit on a chair. They sat cross-legged in the ground, since birth.
Interesting.
And what
Right.
that does for the body is it opens up your hip in a direction called external rotation. So
Huh.
postures like lotus position, which most people are familiar with, a picture of a cross-legged lotus position.
Right.
These positions were considered very easy for Indian people and very easy when you account for it in their sequencing. So, like if you look at traditional yoga sequencing, it's flawed in the way that it assumes mobilities we simply don't have. And that's by
Interesting.
virtue of the fact that we sit in chairs. It shortens our
Right.
hamstrings and limits our external rotation. So, when you try to bend your knee and then rotate your hip at the same time, you're likely to injure yourself here. So, I
Interesting.
had to create a new sequence that approached like an unraveling of sorts in our
Yeah.
own body to get rid of the tension patterns that we have that are unique to us as Westerners.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
and that's really, I mean, that is one of the things that's different. There's many things that are different about Adamantine Yoga, but the sequence, and to say you created it is, I mean, I know you're adamant that these movements have been around for a long, long time, but you've really created this sequence, to your point, that allows people like myself that have a
Mhm.
difficult time, even touching their ankles when we started the process, to be able to do this. And I think even hearing like that revelation of, oh wait, because of the way we work, the way that we sit, all of those things, it's like it's understandable. But as you started to realize this sequence and put the sequence together, I know there's a lot of different people practicing yoga in a lot of different ways, a lot of different types of studios. A lot of dream think doers are innovators, right? They're globe changers. And if they see a rule that needs to be broken or changed, they'll do it. But there's always pushback. Was there pushback either internally or externally for you as you started to like approach it differently, kind of put this different sequence together?
Yes. And I would say, still to this day, the way that we teach yoga in Adamantine is probably, less than 1% of the way people are encountering yoga.
Huh.
Everybody these days is encountering yoga in a group class format or some
Yeah.
kind of one size fits all format.
Yeah.
And like one of the first reactions I had was like, that doesn't make any sense.
Huh.
If you compare it to physical therapy or psychotherapy, the
Right.
idea of doing like group physical therapy or group psychotherapy makes like no sense whatsoever.
Right.
But what we're doing physically in yoga is no less powerful in the amount of transformation it can evoke.
Yeah.
So the idea of putting a group of 30 to 60 people together in a room and telling them to do all the same thing is a one size fits all approach that's silly at best. And that's
Hmm.
still ubiquitous in the yoga industry.
Sure.
So what I've done is change that. We've created a style that's focused on the individual, whether they're in our studio or at home doing the practice. It can be upsized to fit their unique needs. Now
Yeah.
that makes total sense, especially to people who aren't trained in yoga. But in the yoga industry, it's done so differently that people still don't know what to do with that.
Well, and as I heard you say that too, I was reminded of that Mark Twain quote that it's hard to convince somebody they're wrong if their job depends on them being right.
Yeah, that's a
And
good
I would
point.
imagine that many times, many studios, if someone heard that and go, wait, if I'm not teaching this to groups, then I'm not teaching.
Mhm.
So I would imagine that's a little bit like, wait, that doesn't make sense. Or maybe you've taken, Dream Think Doer that you're listening, maybe you've taken a yoga class in that format that you're talking about. Everybody's doing the same thing and thought, ooh, this is not for me. So I've now gotten to experience how you do it individually, but yet everybody's in the room. I mean, 5:30 in the morning in downtown Des Moines, and you've got a room full of people all doing their sequences and stuff. So it's still a group, but how have you found that that's different?
Well, it's different because it's empowering. Basically, we're putting the power in the hands of the practitioner. Right now, the way yoga mostly functions is people are dependent upon someone else telling them what to do.
Mm,
What we do is we provide this map of mobility. So the Adamantine Yoga sequence is basically a map of all of the different mobilities the human body can perform,
yeah,
brought to what I think is a theoretical good enough. Like if you can do these positions, you're going to thrive in your life, right?
right.
But the thing that's amazing about it is I can take a group of completely diverse people and make it fit each one of them. So they're basically practicing on their own, essentially, but empowered with this really powerful sequence.
Yeah.
So, something I don't know if you've been aware of, if you've looked around the room, we have so many husbands and wives that practice together. And that doesn't happen so much traditionally in yoga because ability level is so different.
Yeah.
But like
Absolutely.
this way, both of their needs can be met perfectly when they come to class. So just so this makes a little bit of sense to your audience,
Yeah.
we basically offer people a window of opportunity to attend class. It's from 5:30 in the morning until 9. They can come and go as they please. And whenever they come, they're moving through their sequence, basically supervised by a team of teachers.
Yeah.
So at any given moment during morning class, we might have between 10 and 20 people practicing in the room and between 2 and 3 teachers.
Yeah.
And as the students move through the practice, we basically supervise and assist and adjust and progress them as they need.
Yeah. It's really a fascinating experience. Like, especially, like I said, I've had some experience with martial arts as an example, or doing,
Mhm.
kind of group exercise classes. And it's a very, you had talked about how you were excited for me to actually experience more, the physical aspects of it, being more limber, all of those things, but also just being able to be more peaceful. And it's like moving meditation when it's done in this way, because you really do learn the sequence, and then it really, like, I can get lost in it. It's almost like rock climbing. Like when you're rock climbing, at least for me, when terror grips you, the only thing you can focus on is holding onto that rock, right? And it's
I
in
can
this way, it's
imagine.
less terror, but in the similar way of, you just get so focused, you can't really be thinking about anything else, which is a really powerful experience. So I love it. Now, one of the other things that really stood out to me about the school too was, in some way, the simplicity of the design, but also your 4 tenets, which I know are foundational for you, and I think for Dream Think Doers. This is, I mentioned this a little earlier, that these 4 tenets, as we talk about how you formulated them for the school, all of that obviously important to the school, but and for your studio, but I'm like, gosh, these are things we need to be reminded of every day. Like, if we built off of this foundation, or if everybody built off this foundation, we'd probably be in a much better shape as a globe, right? As a world. So talk me through these 4 tenets. Like, how did you discover them? And what are they?
Amazing question. Okay.
Yeah.
Firstly, it can be said that I felt the postural aspect of yoga needed a bit of an upgrade, right? And
Yeah.
that's kind of the work that I've done in Adamantine. But I also felt that the spiritual component needed a little bit of a closer examination
Yeah.
because I felt like it wasn't accessible to people. In fact,
Yeah.
it became kind of a barrier to entry for most people.
Yeah.
So when I thought deeply about like, okay, what universally accessible spiritual qualities do you automatically gain by virtue of doing this practice? I encountered four things.
Yeah.
And this is how I encountered them, okay? The first is integrity. There needs to be a consistency between your intentions and your actions.
Yeah.
So if you decide, in the evening, you're going to get up in the morning and do your yoga practice, in the morning, you have to actually do it to progress,
Right.
And if you don't, well, nothing happens and eventually you quit practicing yoga, right? So you're either going to learn the quality of integrity or you bring it to the table already.
Yeah.
And I would say most people who practice Adamantine Yoga bring that quality because they've learned it somewhere else already. In
Yeah.
fact, I would say they're very similar to you, Mitch. They're people of very high integrity.
Hmm.
You just need to point them in a direction, right?
Yeah.
But here's the problem, okay? Tenet number 2.
Yes.
People of high integrity tend to be overly ambitious to the point of being aggressive in the way
Yeah.
that they drive themselves to do things. So they decide in the evening they're going to practice the next morning. They wake up and they're sick, and they're going to practice anyway. Darn it,
Yeah.
they're gonna do what they set their
Come
mind to
hell
do.
or high water,
Right.
I'm getting this thing done. I'm going to get
Right.
relaxed while I use yoga. Dang it. Yeah.
Right. And that teaches you the quality of nonviolence.
Yeah.
Because the first person you have to learn nonviolence on is yourself.
Yeah.
So you can show up every day, but if you do it in such a way that's rigid and intolerant, you're going to create problems. And sooner or later, you're going to hurt yourself.
Yeah.
And you are, through repetition, going to necessarily learn how to cherish yourself in your practice in such a way that allows you to thrive. So again, right. I feel like each one of these tenets, if you don't master it, you're going to end up washing out.
Right. And that is what I think is interesting is like these tenets are obviously, 4 things you can live by, but they do actually, and I'm sure by design, help you to continue your practice of yoga, right? Like obviously there's the connection, but it is, they build on each other too, which is interesting.
Absolutely. They kind of do, right?
Yeah.
All right. So you can be of high integrity. You can approach the mat every day and be nonviolent. But at some point, you have to learn the quality of surrender. And Mitch, I know this lesson lies ahead of you with your practice, okay?
Because I'm wrestling this to the ground, right?
It does not happen quick. It's
right.
Not a quick process. Like you measure yoga in years, not weeks or months.
Yeah.
So sometimes you'll go a year and you'll think back, like, wow, now I see change. But when I look back 60 days, it feels like I'm doing the exact same thing.
Yeah.
So that could be an unpleasant experience if you continue to try to force it or you have unrealistic expectations. You have to kind of surrender to the process if you're going to enjoy it, right?
Yep.
All right. So far we've got integrity, nonviolence, and surrender.
Well, and I want to throw something in there.
Go ahead.
I'm going to interrupt you because I'm rude like that. But with surrender, I think, I didn't fully understand the 4 tenets when we first started on this, right? Like we've known each other for a while. All of that. But when we finally decided that I was going to do this, I came in for an initial session and did, some of the poses, some of those things kind of showed my flexibility or lack thereof, all of that. And you were real straightforward with me. You're like, dude, you're tight. Probably one of the tightest people I've worked with, maybe as tight as I was, or maybe not quite as tight as I was coming out of the Marines. And you're like, you got to get ready. This is not a quick fix. You gotta kind of hold loosely to this, that as you do this, it will be amazing, but it could be a couple years out. And I'm thinking as a marketer, this is the worst sales job ever. Doesn't he realize this is America? You're supposed to promise everything in 30 days or less, right? But I'm like, you know what? There is so much power to that, to be able to say, okay, this is like, I want something bigger. And like, I mentioned in the interview or the intro, like I literally do want to be in the best shape of my life in the coming years, not in my past years. And I think it's possible with something like this, but you do have to surrender to it. This is definitely not something you can just white knuckle and wrestle to the ground.
No, it's just so worth it. And I think that the ability I have to be straightforward with people comes directly from the fact that I've been there myself.
Yeah.
Like there's no point on this path that you're going to walk that I haven't been through myself. And I know how worth it is. So I know that at 48, I moved significantly better than I did when I was in the Marine Corps, in my early 20s.
Yeah.
And like that is worth experiencing. Plus, I know a much quicker road, Mitch. Like I know it's not going to take you 20 years. Like
Right.
I've got a better way to do this now.
Yep.
I can make you at 55 and 60 far more mobile than you are today. And I know that to be a fact.
Well, and I think the second time I was in there was a woman that was practicing next to me, and she was in the full splits. And you're like, you should probably know. You said she was 63,
67 or something
67,
like that.
And I'm like, okay, that's awesome. New goals, right? Like that is incredible. And so, that's huge. All right. So we've got integrity, nonviolence, surrender. I will stop interrupting you. What's our fourth one? Bring us
There
home.
is one more. And I felt like you can show up every day. You can do it in a compassionate way. You can surrender, which could be, I don't know, almost like a negative thing, like a giving up, right?
Right.
Unless you color it with gratitude. Like if you don't walk away from the mat grateful for what happened today and grateful for the ability you currently have, it's not going to be a very, very pleasant experience, right? So I feel that like in order to progress in this path significantly, you have to master these qualities. You will necessarily master these qualities. And I think you'd agree with me. These things are accessible to anyone of any, tradition, religious or otherwise. They can bring these into their life and live a more full life as a result. So if somebody can learn these on the mat, they start to bleed over into the way you behave off of the mat as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's, again, these are 4 tenets that anybody could be reminded of daily and be better off because of it. So that's dream thing doers. Hey, whether you sign up for yoga or not, or whether you try to do this or not, I think living with integrity and nonviolence, surrender, and gratitude. And I love each, your descriptions on each of those, because there's many layers to those things, but understanding that I think is a really important thing. Now, and so one thing I do want to touch on, though, I think is also, was fascinating to me, because, we've talked about, our different faith walks and backgrounds and all those kinds of things. And for me, that was a big question, because I think when it comes to yoga, there's a lot of perception of religion, spirituality, all of those things. And I know, for some people, I'm a Jesus guy, all of that. For some people are like, I can't do it because there's a religious component that might mess with my faith. But that's also something you and I talked about. And I think that's something that's really important for people to hear about a little bit too. And what's your take on that when it comes to maybe yoga in general, but also kind of how you've then looked at that and applied it in Adamantine?
I think that one of the reasons I've been planted here in the Midwest is because I needed to create something that was accessible. And I think that I can't say it was a mistake. It's just what happened. I think when yoga was imported into the West, we took it part and parcel. We took the whole culture with it. And I think people to this day aren't sure how to separate the two.
Yeah.
See, in the tradition of yoga in the East, there was this relationship of student to teacher known as guru to disciple. And this was a relationship of strict obedience without question, right?
Interesting.
And that largely has to do with the fact that the teachers were much older adults and the students were very young children, right? We've imported that relationship into the tradition of yoga in the West, and we've tended to duplicate what they were doing without question. And that, I think, is problematic. So yoga, the physical part of yoga, in theory, predates some of the religious traditions that we're bringing along with it. And I think the fundamental ideas behind it, what really makes it work, there's a universal spirituality of movement and breath that is accessible to anyone ever, anywhere. As you change your body, you think, feel, and act different in your life. And for me personally, when I started practicing, I knew nothing of the spirituality. And I experienced radical transformation. So I went into it knowing already there was something here that transcended what I was seeing other traditions do. So what I was interested in is how can I extract the core, the stuff that really makes this work, and make it more accessible to people.
Yeah. That's awesome. And so that's for you. It is truly, it's more to the tenets. It's not necessarily, because I know some approaches to yoga very much involves a spiritual or religious aspect, but that's not necessarily something you feel is required or definitely a part of.
Yoga is a big word in the East. And what we don't realize is what we call yoga here is like one little division of it. And it actually was never a popular division in the East at all. Nobody practiced hatha yoga. They practiced things like bhakti yoga, which is the yoga of devotion. So we've
Huh.
kind of like sandwiched some of these elements together and brought it over here by mistake in some ways. And I think in some ways, the most accessible and the most necessary form of yoga for Westerners, because of our materialism,
Mm-hmm.
because of our sedentary lifestyles, is the one that meets us where we're at. It's the one
Mm.
that it's like the way of health and well-being.
Yeah.
Because as we take better care, I mean, think of it this simply, okay? When you feel good, you're kinder and nicer to the people in your lives. A
Yeah.
whole system of spirituality could be built around that. When I feel sick, you don't want to be around me, okay?
That's
When I
right.
feel great, I'm a nice guy.
Yeah.
It can be that simple. It doesn't have to be bizarre in Sanskrit or Buddhist
Right.
or Hindu. It doesn't need to be that. Just be a good person.
Yeah.
And if I can make you feel better, you're going to be that guy, you know?
What is it? It is interesting, especially again, as a, faith-filled or spiritual person,
Hmm.
the just even, and I can't, I've been 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks,
Hmm.
3 weeks. But as you are more flexible, it is amazing how it does kind of open up, not necessarily from a spiritual level, but if you truly are more flexible in your body, you'll tend to be a lot more flexible and open in your life, to whether that's
Absolutely.
being guided by the spirit or whether that's being open to ideas or whatever. So it's one of those where it's like, it's not an either or. It is a beautiful, especially with the way you're approaching it, is just a beautiful thing. Now, I love innovation. I'm a student in innovation. And one of the other things that really grabbed me with what you're doing is you really are taking it from, you have your studio here in Des Moines, but the next phase of this is really being able to reach the world. And when I
Mhm.
started to hear about this, a little mind blowing, because I'm like, how would that work? Because I get how it could happen in a studio, but how could you do this online? Because like you, I've seen the DVDs, I've seen the VHS tapes, and it's like, that doesn't seem to be what you're doing. So talk to us a little bit about this next phase. Again, even just from the under the umbrella of an innovative approach. What are you guys
Mhm.
doing?
Well, firstly, I had an epiphany about a year ago when I realized that what's happening online for people with yoga is just as fruitless as what's happening in most yoga studios.
Mm.
They're experiencing the same lack of individualization. They're going to
Yeah.
YouTube or Yoga Glow and basically doing some sequence that someone created generally for the public, which is
Mm.
not what you need,
Yeah.
right? So I realized that the Adamantine sequence being something that we can teach people to individualize is going to be a far better way for people to practice at home. And I think to this day, I mean, you mentioned 20 million people in the intro, right? 20 million
Yeah.
people practicing yoga just in America alone, right?
Right.
And probably largely a big number of those people are people that identify with practicing at home.
Right.
So they can do it better. And
Right.
that's when I realized like maybe the way to get Adamantine yoga to the world isn't through studios or a franchise model, but maybe it's through the individual, through the internet.
Yeah.
So, all right, nuts and bolts.
Yeah.
We've created a reference tool that basically demonstrates posture by posture the Adamantine yoga sequence. Then we created a membership program that supports people at home in a community. And now we're getting ready to roll out a basic training that's going to invite in brand new people and teach them to level up so that they can join our membership by using this reference course and showing them how they can modify each position to suit their ability level.
Yeah. Well, and it's also, I think it's fascinating too, because one of the things we started to talk about this, because, we're both in the entrepreneurial space here and started to connect on this front. I was fascinated because we've done a ton of online training. We've done all that, but it's like, okay, all of our stuff is brain stuff and business strategy stuff. It's not physical movement, but you even have the aspects of being able to provide coaching, which I challenged you. I'm like, I'm on the road all the time. Show me how this could work on the road. And literally you are offering kind of virtual coaching where I sent
Yes.
you a video of me going through the sequence and you were able to get back to me and say, hey, with arrows, like, and being able to
Mm-hmm.
say here and tweak this and all that stuff. And I'm like, oh my gosh, in some ways, it's as powerful, if not more powerful, than being in the studio, because now I can watch that video and cringe seeing myself, right? But also go, oh, that is in fact what I'm doing wrong, and see it versus just feel it, which is really crazy. It's amazing.
Well, honestly, that's the greatest insight I've had since we started this project of moving Adamantine online
Yeah.
is, and I can't even believe I'm saying this. I would have never thought the day would come. I think it's quite possible that someone can learn yoga more effectively through video than they
Yeah.
can in person. And here's
Right.
the reason, this will make sense to all your listeners, is when I tell you in person to bend your knees or soften your hands or relax your face, you
Yeah.
have to subjectively feel that.
Right.
When you see it on video, like you saw your video the other day, it's obvious you need to bend your knees, right?
Right.
Like you
Yeah.
see it right
Speaking of
away.
downward facing
Yeah,
dog, hello.
you know who I'm talking to. Like it becomes super obvious because suddenly you become objective about your own practice.
Right.
So because we have this reference tool for you to refer back to, and then a coach that's telling you exactly what to do, you can really study this in a way that you couldn't in a studio. So I
Yeah.
think it could be the best way to learn yoga.
It's exciting. It's amazing. I just, again, I think it is an incredible example of innovation, right? But I also think that you're onto something huge at a time that it's very much needed. So I'm excited for you. How do people find out more about you and Adamantine Yoga?
Adamantineyoga.com. It's that
Nice.
simple. Yeah, if you visit the website, there is a wait list for the upcoming basic training. If you're interested in hearing more about it, sign up for that list.
Awesome.
We'd love to get you involved.
That's very, very cool. All right. We'll put all that in the resources too on the post. But James, keep doing what you're doing, man. Thanks for helping me. Thanks for helping the Dream Think Do audience as well, man. This is exciting stuff.
Well, thanks for having me, Mitch. I appreciate it.